My name is Justin J. Lee, and I'm a divorce lawyer in Toronto, Canada. And this is Happily Ever Maybe. It's a space for people to share their own stories and advice about their own personal separation and divorce. And I hope that by listening in or watching, you'll gain some comfort, some guidance, or maybe even a little bit of hope. Let's get started. So, Liana.
Yes.
I'm going to try and see if I can remember the stats. 42 years old.
You got it, yeah.
Got a 4-year-old son.
Yes.
Was with your ex for 10 years, married for 6.
Correct.
Okay, so what I don't have is when were you separated?
We got separated in September of 2022.
Okay.
So it's been 2 years, yeah.
Got it. Okay, and so it was in 2016 that you got married.
Yes.
In 2012 that you started dating him.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
2013, yeah.
Did you live together prior to marriage?
We did, yeah. And we lived together pretty much right away when we met each other. So we met when I was traveling. So I was a law clerk and I was in the midst of a mental breakdown, and I convinced my boss that he wasn't ever going to have kids. And I said, I just need to get away. Like, instead of a maternity leave, will you give me a year sabbatical? And so he said yes, and then kind of whittled it down to 6 months. But with that time, I got a visa and went to Australia. So I did a little traveling first. I went to Korea, New Zealand, and then I arrived in Australia, and that's where I met my ex.
And your ex was also traveling? Or
He was, yeah. He's from the UK, so he was hoping to get residency in Australia. And we actually just met at a hostel, and we hit it off really well. And I was traveling with my best friend at the time. She came over for a month to travel with me. And when the traveling was done, he invited me to come and do farm work with him, which is, part of a requirement if you want to stay longer in Australia. So it was kind of like the perfect setup. I could go do the farm work if I want at a beautiful rose farm in Perth. We could spend more time together and get to know each other because we seem to really have a connection. And so we started living together in Perth, and then we moved to Brisbane, and we just never really stopped living with each other. So I had to go back to Canada, and he came with me. And then,
when was that, when you came here?
I came back in like July 2013, and I think he had to go back and forth a few times, but yeah, essentially he lived with me.
Wow, so, that was a pretty big because your home base is here.
Yes.
But for him,
yes.
That was a pretty big leap that he had to take.
It was. He was looking for something different, though. He really wanted to be out of the UK. He really hated it. And, he had really exhausted his potential in Australia. Australia, unless, you have particular requirements, is quite hard to stay in.
Yeah.
And he had kind of done his visitor visa time, he'd done his travel visa time, he was starting a student visa time, but it was just becoming more and more clear that wasn't going to be an avenue for him. And so I think it actually worked out quite nicely that I lived in Canada and that our relationship, was going well at the time for him to come over, yeah.
And was he pursuing an education at the time, or...?
Not really, no. He was just doing that so he could stay in Australia. He was doing like a business college. But he was looking for what it was he was going to do with his life. He was kind of looking for a career. So,
So your friend that traveled with you, she had encounters with your ex, I assume,
for sure,
in Australia.
Yes.
What was her take on all that at the time? Because I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming she was there witnessing the start of a romantic dynamic between the two of you.
Yeah, so we only, so it's my best friend Bev who came to visit me, and she came to Brisbane. I had already been in Australia for a month. I had spent my time in Melbourne. Loved it there. It was so much fun, but it was time to move on. So we were meeting in Brisbane, and then we were going to go up the coast, which is like the normal kind of tourist route. And that's what we were going to do, and then come into Adelaide and around. So I had planned our whole trip. So when we got to Brisbane, I think we only had 2 or 3 days there. And when we got to the hostel, we met Phil right away. He helped us kind of plan some of our time in Brisbane, which was nice because he knew it there. But for sure, Bev and Phil had not a good encounter and a good time when they met each other. And there was some tension throughout our whole relationship about that. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
What was the source of the conflict when they met? And I'm asking because it's so cliche, right? Like, somebody dates somebody for a long time or gets married, later breaks up. And in hindsight, there's always that friend who was there trying to tell the
Yes.
person he's not a good person or she's not a good person, whatever the case may be. So that's why I thought it was very interesting that there was a friend in that story. So I'm very curious as to where sort of if she had any sort of opinions or...
For sure. And, I think to start off right off the bat, as soon as my relationship with Phil ended and I had some more time to do some reflection and soul searching and really come to grips with things, I absolutely 100% apologized to my friend. I validated her feelings and said, I believed you. I just didn't have the capability at the time to fully recognize what you were saying. And so when Bev first got to Australia, she was off of a 24-hour flight, and she was, her senses were fairly heightened. And she just didn't get a good feeling off of Phil. Like there was some things that had happened, but she just didn't really get a good feeling off of him, didn't really like him, and felt quite, I would say, almost annoyed. And I didn't catch that same sense. So I was already relaxed. I'd been there for a while. I was used to the hostile culture. I was used to people kind of jumping up and being there. And so I didn't have that same sense of feeling. And she did express and share it with me. And I recognized it, but I also recognized that we were both in different places. And when we stayed at the hostel the first night, we both went to bed early, and they didn't start the air conditioning till late at night. So Phil had actually set up a fan and put it on us. And when I woke up in the morning, I realized that it was him who had done that. And I thought, that's really sweet. And so I gave so much credit and put so much into that one act of thoughtfulness, where as we traveled around a little bit, because I think we spent 2 days together, Bev was better at picking up on the red flags and picking up on some of the behavior that would later become a problem in the relationship. But I was just so wrapped up in that one act of kindness, that I didn't take the other things so seriously. Yeah.
People probably relate a lot to when you say, I believed you. Whoever it was that was trying to tell them, look, I think this is what's happening, or whatever the case may be, but you just didn't have the capabilities at the time, right? In hindsight, everything's 2020, and in hindsight, it's easy to say, I should have known better, or I should have picked up on that. It's certainly a lot easier for a third person who's got no sort of personal stakes to look at that situation and pick up on things or be critical, right? But when you're in it, and particularly if you are sort of in the state of mind, or if you're just at a place in your life where you're not the most perceptive, the most secure, you're just so worn out that you need something good to finally just come across your life. Because it's not common for somebody to ask their boss for a leave in the way that you have.
Yeah.
And I don't doubt at all that for you to have sort of made that request in the first place, that you months leading up to that point must have been very hard for you, right?
Yeah, you're extremely perceptive, and that's a really great kind of lead into it. But yeah, I was extraordinarily sad. I was coming off of a big heartbreak, as well as feelings of loneliness, which were so strange and difficult, because I was in Toronto at that time, probably a city of 2 million, a little less than it is now, surrounded by people all the time, feeling the loneliest I had ever felt in my life. And I still had best friends. I had beautiful connections. I had a horse, and I went to a barn in Orangeville every night. I had a social life. I had all sorts of things, but I just was not happy. I was so crushingly depressed. And I know that I needed to change something, and it had to be something big. And so you're absolutely right. When I got to Australia, I was so sad. I was so sad. And then there was this one person who seemed to hear me and kind of validate me and who seemed at that time to want me. And, it's funny because when you really look back after everything has happened, I'm not sure how much I really even loved Phil in the relationship. I feel like maybe I always had a bit of a foot out the door, which was never going to make a successful marriage, was never going to make a successful relationship. But at the time, I didn't realize it and I couldn't see it. And I really didn't see my own sadness and how much I needed validation from another person.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's something that I'm working on now. Like I'm on a whole journey now.
Yeah. As a divorce lawyer, I hear these stories a lot. And, a lot of people in your shoes carry a lot of shame, right? And so, I paused for a second because I was going to say, have you felt a lot of shame? But then I already know the answer to that. And so I was going to say instead, how much did you beat yourself up over just looking back and thinking I could have done things differently, or that you should have known better, or that, you should have listened to your friend Bev? Tell me a little bit about that. Like what was a self-work sort of journey like for you?
Yeah, so I'm really lucky in a lot of ways. My life is just absolutely blessed. But there were some difficulties in my marriage that happened about 2 years after we got married. And the best way to describe it is really like online infidelity, which I found out kind of shockingly. It wasn't something that was gradually introduced or that I had any idea about. It was just all of a sudden kind of upon me. And I really struggled. It was another period of depression in my life and really questioning what was going on. And so at that time, I decided that I wanted to take accountability and responsibility, and I needed to do something different. That, we had only been married 2 years. I wasn't ready to give up on the marriage, and that I needed to do some work and change some things and make things better, because I also recognized that I wasn't the best partner that I thought I could be. And so I was really lucky to one day stumble upon this meditation group that was at a Midnight Madness event. And so they invited me in to do a 5-minute meditation. And I went into the tent, and it was the first time in my life that I really was present. And so we sat there and did the meditation, and this was at the same time as all of this terrible stuff was going on with this infidelity and kind of questioning what my values were, what was I doing, where was I going to go? And I just sat in this tent on the street, and I heard all the noise around me, and I just realized that there's a whole big world out there, and I was just in my own head, and I couldn't see any of that. And so I started going to this group, and it turns out that they're a non-secular Buddhist group. And from there, I did a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. I started going every single week. I started learning a lot of the theories of mindfulness, from Jon Kabat-Zinn and a lot of the non-secular Buddhists. And, there is Buddhism mixed in there as well. But that really allowed me to work on myself, and it really allowed me to take those shoulds out of my life and to not worry about shame, and to not spend a lot of my time looking back going, what if I did this? What if I did that? Because I was just on the course of my life now. And so I had to make decisions in those moments about, okay, well, it doesn't matter what could have happened. I am here at what is happening. And so how should I deal with that? And so I feel so lucky to have found that group, and I'm still part of it. I'm on the board of directors for the Center of Mindfulness in Muskoka. It's a really important part of my life, and it allowed me to deal with a lot of those feelings. Another great thing was, and we'll talk about it probably in a moment, the circumstances of my leaving, but when I was leaving, I immediately booked a therapy appointment. And so literally the second day that I was out of the house, I had a therapist appointment. And I'm still seeing that therapist 2 years later. She is absolutely amazing. I love her. She's so wonderful and yet tough on me. She holds my feet to the fire a little bit. And so that also helped, because I didn't have to spend a lot of that time in shame or regression. But it was difficult because my parents are still together. A lot of my aunts and uncles are still together. There's very few people who have left their partnership. And so I was almost kind of a radical at leaving my marriage and being the one to leave, especially when I had a child. So I was lucky, but there could have been a lot more shame than there was, I think.
Yeah. So this online infidelity happens 2 years into the marriage. And you said it kind of hit you like a ton of bricks, and you just did not see that coming.
For sure.
In hindsight, were there things throughout the first 2 years of your marriage that you think now kind of makes sense, or there's like a piece of puzzle that now fits, or even in hindsight, was it a complete, total surprise?
I don't think that I ever could have seen that in particular coming. That was quite shocking. But there were lots of things that I didn't like and I didn't agree with, and I swept under the carpet. Like, for instance, even when I was having to come back to Canada. So I came back to Canada early. I felt a lot of pressure from different sources in my life that I needed to come home. I think a lot of people were worried I was going to stay in Australia forever, especially because I had a boyfriend there now who had plans. And I think a lot of people in my life were quite worried that if they didn't take action, I wouldn't be coming home. So I did feel a lot of pressure to come home. But at that point, realistically in my relationship, I had noticed that there was a lot of anger from Phil that I wasn't comfortable with. There was a lot of behaviors of his and morals that I didn't agree with. But it wasn't the end of the world because it was just a travel boyfriend, right? Like, we got along, everything was great, but the future was very uncertain. And we were very honest about that we cared for each other a lot. But like, you have to look at the situation in terms of even international visas. And so when I said, okay, that's it, I'm going, Phil was really upset, and he threw what I would call a tantrum. He had a big fit, and then he just said, oh, fine, I'm coming. Like, I hadn't even invited him, and he just said, fine, I'm coming. And that was a moment where I could have created space, or I could have said, I didn't want you to, or, why don't you come in a month or two? But I was too afraid to do that. And not because Phil was physically threatening or anything. It's just, I want to please people. I want to have confluence. I don't have, necessarily a lot of self-esteem. And so it was just easier for me to say, yeah, that sounds great. Come on over, Yeah. That was that moment, I think the biggest moment for me, where I knew it in my heart and I could have stopped it, but I didn't have the courage just yet to do that. Yeah. And I was in a really unstable position too. I was coming back. And I knew I wasn't going back to my law clerk job. I'd already decided that I couldn't go back to that. So I was looking at different avenues of career. I was looking, I can't live in Toronto anymore. Where am I going to live? There was so much unstable. And I had this one stability in this relationship. If I want to look back, that is the moment that I look back at most often and say, that was the herald of everything that was going to come. Yeah.
And tell me about when you were breaking the news to your family, your friend Bev, that Phil was now going to join you in Canada. How did that go when you told him that
he was going to join me in Canada? Yeah. So my parents knew a little bit, like they knew of Phil and they had kind of seen him on the phone, and I don't know how seriously they had taken our relationship. I think they were fine with him coming over and they didn't really have a lot to say. I don't think Bev was the most pleased she's ever been, but Bev is a beautiful and supportive friend and recognizes that I'm independent. And if that's my choice, then it is. I think she did try and warn my family that maybe it wasn't kind of the healthiest of relationships at that point, or that there were concerns that she had as well. And that created a little bit of tension. And looking back, that, that was the right thing to do. But when I got there, the first meeting with Phil and my mom did not go well. He spent the time angrily berating Canada and how he didn't want to be there, and which caused me to cry. Yeah, it was the first time meeting my mom, causing me to cry in front of my mother, and like, God bless her. But she also believes in my independence, and so she was supportive in the fact that, this is now happening. This is the person her daughter brought home. They're living together and everybody has their ups and downs. And so just like allowing me to navigate through that. And that's really it, is that you can't force someone to make the decisions you want them to make, even if you can see it from a mile out that they're not right for each other, or that things aren't going well, or this is a toxic or unhealthy relationship. You can't
Yeah.
you can't make someone see that. All you can do is love them and support them the best you can. Yeah.
No, it is frustrating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It is frustrating being, well, in everybody's shoes in that sort of circumstance, right? Like in being in your shoes, having to sort of always fight against these disapprovals, let's say, of your own family members whom you love dearly and they love you dearly. And it's not like you can cut them out of your life. And at the same time, for your family members who really just want the best things for you and who can clearly see that there's something here that you're not able to see. And for your friend, the same thing too. So it's a very complicated, right? It's not very. It's very complicated, which explains why I have a job.
I know this is human relations, though. This is human relationships, and there's nothing simple about it. And like my parents are lovely and beautiful and super supportive. Like there was a time too when they let Phil and I live with them, which was absolutely shameful for me to be an adult and live with your parents. Little did I know 10 years later, we'd all be adults living with our parents. But I mean, my dad gave Phil a job when he was having trouble getting a job in this country when he just started out. And so my parents supported us in in a myriad of ways. But even now, my mom will say like, yeah, I saw that he was controlling you. I saw how controlling he was this whole time. But I just didn't feel like there was a way to break that control because you were already so deeply into this relationship. And, that's a responsibility that I have to take as well for my codependence and my wanting to please people and not disappoint them and putting my own wants and needs second, or not even sometimes that, but just wanting to avoid the conflict, which again is another really natural human response. And it's super easy to blame on someone else and say, you made me do this. No, it's just that I wanted to avoid the conflict of what it would have looked like to say, this isn't working out right now. Yeah.
For the controlling aspects that existed between your relationship with him, was it that in hindsight that you like literally just couldn't see it, or that at the time you saw it but you could not deal with it, that you couldn't acknowledge it?
It was both. So I think my mom saw the controlling aspect before I did, for certain. But the control was, for me, a large part of our relationship. So I like having free time. I like being independent and doing my own things and picking my own activities. I like having my own money. And that was one of the things that we always talked about and practiced was that we had separate money. And, in the marriage, it came to the point where I couldn't even buy a cup of coffee without getting chastised for it because it was a waste of money. It wasn't the right way to spend money. And if I went and spent money on my hobbies, because I've had really intense hobbies. I'm a very kind of intense person. And when I get into something, I like really get into it. So there'd be lessons or there'd be gym memberships or there'd be, whatever it was, that was a waste of money. And then when I started with the mindfulness groups and I started helping them build up their board, when I helped them become a nonprofit, then that was a waste of time. And so I got chastised for not spending time on the family matters and that everything I did outside of Phil and I was taking time away from it. But it was a classic game of control. And even like when we were planning the wedding, that should have been a huge red flag for me, was that Phil didn't really want to participate in the wedding. And he basically said, it was because of his social anxieties, which are true and exist. But that it was like, if you want to do this, then you do it. You be the one that kind of does everything. And my mom was very at odds with where she wanted the location of the wedding to be. And so I was just getting pressured from both sides. And finally I said, you guys deal with it. Like, Phil, just talk to my mom and you guys can talk about it. And Phil just said, he looked at my mom and said, it's none of your business. And that just absolutely, immediate hurt feelings, not the right way to deal with it. And again, it created an isolation from my family. It really started to create a rift there. And I think that looking back, you can just see so many classic instances of control. But I knew it in the marriage as well. So like near the end of it, I would start to buy myself coffee, but I would hide it so that I wouldn't get into trouble. And then there came to a point where I was like, why am I hiding this thing? This is my money. These are my choices. It doesn't matter. Like, what really are the consequences that someone's giving me snide comments, that someone's disapproving? Like, that's not really enough for me to continue to change my behavior. And so I just became bold and I went out and did the things that I wanted to do anyway. And I did them out in the open. And so it was kind of even like near the end of the marriage and from the middle, like throughout, was just this like growing of my confidence and this recognition of, really my personhood, I guess.
Can I ask who was the main breadwinner there?
That's a hard, he might have earned just a little bit more than me, but we basically earned the same amount of money.
And it's not like you were making no money, staying at home. No. Which, by the way, and I want to be very clear to everybody that's listening, I don't say that to mean like if you are a stay-at-home parent and make zero income, that the other person is entitled to some level of control over you. That's not what I'm saying at all. But
that exists, yeah.
But, like the audacity, is the word I was looking for, right? Of someone to be in a situation like that where it's more or less a double income family, and for you to feel you're entitled to, control the other person's sort of finances. And look, if, to varying degrees, I suppose, if somebody's out gambling away all their money, that's a different story. But we're talking coffees. We're talking, lessons in gym memberships, which are all there to enhance your life. And it's, it's funny because I think if a lot of the cases I have where I have these kind of controlling dynamics in play, you would think it's like that person who is making all of the money and the other person is just not making any money.
It's
more often than not, first of all, it's either like double income or actually the other person is making more than them. It's
it's the insidiousness of control, and it's the insidiousness of abusive relationships, is that really it seems so silly afterwards. So it seems so silly that I felt that I couldn't buy a coffee when what really were the consequences. But I mean, that's still a narrative in the divorce. I mean, the narrative in the divorce from him is you flitted around from hobby to hobby. You spent all your money on nonsense, and I was the one that built this finance, and you're not entitled to half of it. You can take less, but you also need to recognize and thank me because you wouldn't be in this financial position without me, which is not true. But it's a great narrative, and it's a great narrative to try and make someone believe. And so the thing is, too, it's just these, again, and as human relationships, it's just these little things. Like you meet someone who is maybe a little bit more controlling, who is maybe a little bit more entitled or bold, and then you meet someone who, outwardly, I'm very gregarious, I'm very outgoing, I project a tough persona, but that's not really, who I am inside. And I've recognized I can be quite passive, and I'm quite happy to be controlled. I'm quite easily controlled. I want to see the best in people. I want to display kindness. I want to forgive people all the time. And so when you get a dynamic like that, that's really a perfect dynamic, isn't it? For one person to take control of another person. And they don't even have to do it through nefarious ways. That's the makeup of that relationship. Yeah.
I want to add in here that this element of control is back then it used to be that the only sort of formally recognized form of abusive dynamics was a physical one, right? So unless there was there were bruises on your body, like nobody would really take you seriously when you say that I'm in an abusive dynamic with my partner. But now, thankfully, a lot of that has changed. Still a lot of work to do in that department, but the narrative is changing, and we're having a lot more. Well, there's a lot more sort of recognition that family violence can take form in many different ways. Coercive control is the phrase that we use now, being one of the main ones, right? And I really want to highlight this because, well, first of all, believe me when I say that it is abuse, that it is not right. Second of all, I know that there are a lot of people out there, that are listening or watching, or that just may exist out in the public, that are subject to these sort of treatments that don't recognize that it is actually a form of abuse, right?
Absolutely.
So when your spouse is subtly being passive aggressive about the fact that you are out buying coffee, that cost you $3 at most. That's not because the other person cares about finances. That's not because they know what's best for you. It's control, right? And I really want to highlight this because there are a lot of folks who don't know that they're even in that kind of dangerous situation. The thing is, one might say it's just coffee, who cares? Fine, but it snowballs over time, right? What started off as, merely telling you maybe you should back off on the coffee every day, it turns into, what's the password for your bank account? It turns into, why don't we put all these in a joint account so that we can, both see where our money's going. And then it turns into you suddenly having no bank account, and every one of your direct deposits from work is going into his sole account, et cetera, et cetera. These dynamics are serious, and they need to be taken as such. And so I think it's really important and really insightful that you sharing your story about how he had these controlling tendencies. That could be something as small as coffees, or something a little bit bigger than that, like not being cooperative about the wedding venue, stuff like that. If something similar is happening in anybody's lives that are listening, you need to take that seriously.
100%. And I think too, the really important thing, the thing where I think, speaking for myself, but maybe as some other people that were abused, is that intent doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if that person is stopping you from buying coffee, or is not cooperative in your life, or is keeping you from your friends because they have malicious intent. It doesn't matter if it's for that reason or because they're doing it without an intent, or the reasoning doesn't matter. It's the result that matters. It matters what's actually happening in your dynamic. It's also shameful too. So at that same time as we've already established the control over money a little bit, and we've got the online infidelity, it kind of turned into as well, well, you're not attractive to me. You're not my ideal body type. You're too heavy for me. And so it put on another layer of kind of self-worth issues, and it kind of put on this other layer of depression. And I don't think it was done in a malicious intent to try and control me. It was just, that's what happened. And that was the pattern that was happening, this pattern of devaluing, essentially. And that's stuff that I still deal with, and that I'm really dealing with in my spiritual way of trying not to take things personally, and realizing that this kind of behavior arises out of someone else's causes and conditions. And it happens in your life, but it doesn't happen because of you, and it doesn't determine your worth. So it's been so helpful. And I know people are upset about the term narcissist and, all the narcissistic talk going on, but it's been so unbelievably helpful to see that there's so many other people who are maybe controlled along these same lines, who maybe dealt with someone that has these narcissistic tendencies. It's been so wonderful to use that as a source of education, as a source to hold compassion for myself, to recognize that I'm not alone. And when I first broke up, I spent a lot of time listening to Dr. Romani. She has been so helpful, but it's also something that can be used against people as well, because that's another running narrative, that I'm the narcissist in the relationship, that I'm the one that created harm, and I'm the one that broke up the family. And so it's something that kind of can be used both ways. And I think it's also a moment to take compassion and recognize that there are two truths. And if Phil was in this chair, he would be telling a very different story with very different facts. And that's really not lost on me. It isn't. So I have compassion for what he feels and thinks. And there is still a part of me that has a really hard time talking about the control and talking about some of the things that happened in the relationship, because it is hard to come out and say, yeah, that was a very unhealthy and abusive relationship. It's extraordinarily hard to say, despite the fact that, I think it is true.
Yeah. And I think that's, that ties back to this element of shame, right? It's
absolutely.
I feel like in most of the guests that have come on so far, this element of shame existed in their story. And, I say the same thing over and over again, but you know what? I'm going to say it again because it's really that important, right? If you were on the receiving end of that kind of treatment and you were in an abusive dynamic, the only person that you should point your finger to is that person, right? It's never to yourself. But this element of shame, essentially what you're doing is you're pointing the finger to yourself and saying, what's wrong with me that I have let myself sort of be subject to this? What's wrong with me that I can't do better? What's wrong with me that I couldn't see it back then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember not too long ago, I had a conversation with a doctor who anybody looking at her, would immediately recognize her as a form of authority, somebody who's very capable, very smart, et cetera, et cetera. But she was in an, abusive relationship, quite an abusive relationship, which she later got out of, but later went back to. Mm-hmm. And she had this immense sense of guilt and this shame that she felt, and she was beating herself up over it. But really, right, it's not a question of whether somebody's capable, right? It's not a question of whether somebody's good enough. It's not a question of whether, you should have known better. It's that the other person perpetrated these things on you. Let's not forget the nuance and the context here, which is you're in a romantic relationship with this person. The nature of that dynamic is that you let your guard down.
For sure.
You become vulnerable.
Super intimacy.
Exactly.
Super intimacy.
And you give your trust, because that's what relationships are.
Yeah.
And so it's in that context when all your guards are down and when you can really be the most vulnerable self, they come in and they take advantage of that, right? So again, it's, but I guess what I do really appreciate about what you said earlier, which is that, at the same time that you did a lot of that sort of self-work to be more mindful and attend all these sessions, which I'm sure it wasn't an easy process. You can recognize that the person to blame is the other person, but at the same time, recognize that you could be doing something to better yourself, right? And again, I just want to be very clear here. This is not victim blaming. This is not to say you are the problem. But for anybody, the only thing that you can control is you, right?
Absolutely.
And everybody's got areas of improvement. As soon as somebody says they're perfect, they're lying, right? If somebody, in a similar situation was, who was, subject to those kind of treatments, who don't recognize that on some level there's something they could be doing to better themselves from that point forward, they, I think the Gen Z say they enter into their villain era.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's
they just perpetuate all the hate and negativity out into the world because they were so hurt.
Right.
So I really do appreciate you saying that because, that's the healthy way. That's the productive way of going about a negative experience, right? Grieve, first of all, right? Recognize that it's not your fault. But at the end of the day, to move forward, also recognize that the only thing you can control is you. So what are you going to do about that? Right?
Yeah, that's really important, is the difference between kind of blame and responsibility, and making it very clear that, that person is not responsible for that abuse, but they are responsible to deal with the aftermath. And really the thing that, you'll hear people talk a lot about the work all the time. We're doing the work, or he's not doing the work, or whatever. And, I was listening to a talk today kind of, that dealt with that a little bit. And the reality is the work is dealing with your inner stuff so that you're okay and you're heightening yourself rather than trying to make everything around you okay. So when I'm triggered, I'm dealing with, well, what is that bumping up against? What stuff do I have inside? What am I holding in myself? How am I maybe taking out some things from my earlier life on other people? How can I be kinder? How can I practice forgiveness? And it's kind of looking at all those things rather than controlling the people around me and trying to make all my circumstances okay so that I'm happy, and making sure that the people in my life do exactly the things that I want them to so that I'm not triggered. That's really what that's about, I think.
No, and that's really well put. As somebody who sees this kind of dynamic play out in many, many different people, what's really devastating for someone when they have gone through an experience like that is, well, many things, obviously, but one of them is this sense of losing your agency.
Yeah. Yes.
The sense like you no longer have control of your life anymore. And what taking responsibility, as you say, can do for you is it allows you to start to regain some of that self-control, right? Because again, we come back to this point of the only thing you can really control is you.
And sometimes not even that.
Yeah.
Sometimes
And
you
there's only
can't
so
even
much you can
control
do.
that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And like, sorry to interrupt you there, but I think too, that's where kind of the mindfulness piece has really come along with me, because you're absolutely right. Like, I am not sure how to trust myself yet. And I'm not quite sure when I'm doing the right things or thinking the right thoughts. And so that's why the self-awareness and the mindfulness has really been helpful, because when I think something or I want something, it's almost like I take a back seat and kind of view that thought. And it's like, is this something that's going to be skillful, or is this an unskillful voice from the past? Is this, somebody saying you're not good enough? Is that somebody saying that, that's degrading you in some way? Is that a leave over from that? Or is that really going to help you be the most skillful version of yourself?
Yeah. If I did my math right, at the time that you found out about his online infidelity was around the time that you had your child. Is that
not too far off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that must have been very, very challenging, to say the least, to work through.
Yeah. So the way that happened was, it was 2018 when I found out, very early 2018 when I found out about the online infidelity. And I think it was, I had gone through a terrible summer, and around that fall, I found the mindfulness. So that was around, September 2018. And I really started to work with myself, and I really opened myself up and thought, I can see how I'm not the best person in this relationship. I really want to change myself. I really want to work on some things. I want to extend a sense of grace to my partner, that they've also been dealing with someone that's probably been difficult for them, that probably isn't providing them with the kind of love that they want in the way that they want it. I think sometimes I can be a really hard person in terms of maybe not the most sympathetic at times. And so I really wanted to try and open myself up and really fully commit to this relationship. And we tried couples counseling. We went to 2 sessions before it became, this is too expensive, it's not worth going to counseling, which is another classic. And I just accepted that was his boundary, and he wasn't willing to go, so there's no point. And so I just really started to kind of mind my own business and stay on my own side of the street and not point fingers. And so then as we kind of lived together and life went on, it kind of just went back to a normal, we'll say. And it was around that time, probably, 2019, early 2019, where things were back to relatively normal. We were still traveling together. We were having a lot of fun. I was really working on my forgiveness piece and really working with, that's what happened in the past. And, everybody has their things, and it's kind of time to move on. And then Phil had always wanted children, and I was always unsure. In reality, I had said I didn't want children to everyone around me because it was just easier, because there's so much pressure on women to have children. And so I had just made it very clear I did not want children. I didn't want to talk about it, whatever. But inside, I was always really conflicted about what I wanted. Because although I really loved children and I wanted a child, I didn't necessarily want the roles that went along with that. And I didn't want to sacrifice all of my independence. I didn't want to have to kind of be looked at with pity. I didn't want to have to leave the job market. There's just so many things. And so it was around that time in 2019 where Phil just really started on I want a child, now is the time. And I felt a lot of pressure from him. And at that time, I think I was 36. And I just kind of recognized if I want children, maybe now really is the time. I felt a lot of that biological pressure of people saying, you're 36, you probably can't even get pregnant. Despite the fact that my Oma had 15 kids. I mean, she was having kids into her 50s. You know what I mean? Reproductively, I was fine. But I felt all this pressure that maybe society is right. Maybe this is my only shot. And I'm clearly not leaving this marriage. I've clearly made that decision. So, it's time to try. So we tried in June. And I immediately was we have to stop. I don't know anything about this. I'm not even taking vitamins. I do not know what I'm doing. And I was pregnant. Right away. I got pregnant right away.
Wow.
All that biological piece was absolute nonsense for
Wow.
me. Like, so I felt again, I just felt so much pressure. And so I made that decision. And like, I'm really happy that I did, because my son is the most wonderful person in the world. He's so funny and he's so smart, but he is also the impetus for me leaving my relationship. And I think without him, I just would have accepted that treatment. I just would have accepted that that's as good as it gets for me. And when we had our son, there was a lot of circumstances going on in our life. Phil was renovating a house. He had bought a house kind of on his own and was renovating it. And he was getting very little help from me because I had just had a baby, and, the place was infested with mold. And too, I was the only one taking care of the baby. So I was up at all hours of the night while Phil was doing this renovation. There was a lot of stress. But he just started to become very resentful. And that was the period that really began what I'm going to call the reverse discard. So rather than breaking up with me, he got very mean, was very rude, very resentful all the time. And I finally just realized this is not what I want my son to believe love is. I can't stay here and let my son think that it's okay to see his mother get treated like this. And, Phil and I have talked about it since then, and he's admitted that, he was really resentful, that was not his best time period of life, and he sees how angry he was towards me. But he was angry towards me for many reasons. And instead of being able to deal with it in a productive way, all he could do was just focus that anger on me. And so that's really what the reverse discard is. So it means that I had to be the one to just stand up and say, okay, this is enough.
Yeah.
But again, like, I really don't believe that I could have done that without my son.
Okay, so can I ask, in the time you finding out about the online infidelity, you went to these mindfulness practices and you've done a lot of that self-work. So at the time that, you came to the conclusion to have a baby, where was that issue? Like, have you resolved all that issue at that point? Or was that even in discussion with Phil at the time?
I think we'd resolved it as far as we were going to resolve it. I think we had kind of dealt with it as much as we realized that we could. I mean, Phil was very sorry. He had made steps to change his life, and it was visible. And it was clear we cared very much for each other. But there were also aspects of her life that, maybe didn't line up. And I think we were just two people that were, had made a promise, and we're just trying to make the best out of that. It wasn't like I felt like we were on the rocks and having a child, like as if the child was going to make our relationship better or we were compensating for something. That wasn't really the fact at all. I mean, I think the fact was that we both felt we were staying in this marriage, that we both were putting in whatever work we needed to, and that those things were in the past. And we were very clear about what we wanted from each other. And so that's how we went into parenthood.
Yeah. And what you said about the child being the reason enough or for you to be convinced that you had to leave is a very common narrative. People think that leaving a relationship, when they look at it from the outside, it's a lot easier than it actually is, right? And they say, well, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just say whatever? But the reality of leaving a relationship is, okay, let's break it down a little bit. It's leaving a sort of a life that you've built around. It's leaving the ideal that you were hoping to achieve eventually. It's leaving, for some people, literally the only thing that they know in their lives. So to say that, you could have just left or why didn't you just leave is very naive, first of all. And I say all this because for that exact reason, people have a hard time leaving. And for a lot of women, typically, what I hear is that when it was just me, the benefit of the stability, the certainty, continuing that relationship outweighed the cons. But as soon as a child gets involved, it's very different.
It is. And I would fully own that too. So like in 2018, when it was just us, and we had gone to therapy and it failed. And, there was this stuff about, my physical appearance and all of that. Of course, I really seriously thought about it. And I didn't talk to anybody at that time about it. I didn't talk to my friends. I didn't talk to my family. I was very secretive because I felt if I opened this all up to them and then I didn't leave, that people might be disappointed in me. They might have their own opinions. Maybe they'd look down on me as I was always this like abused and sad person. And I also didn't want to trouble them with it if I wasn't sure I was going to do it. And so like I really isolated myself in that sense. But I also looked at my life and I was like, he's not perfect and neither am I, but this is a partnership in which we both value travel. We both love, we have a job that we take the winter off and we go away for 6 to 8 weeks. That would be hard to find in another partner. We owned a house together. I had sponsored him to come over. I personally had done his entire permanent residency application. So I was legally also responsible for him at that time. I also felt like we had just been married for 2 years. The wedding felt so fresh. Like people gave me presents. Did I have to return these presents? Like this is seriously what I was thinking about. And a lot of my thoughts were about these other people and how I would have failed them. And it was also about like, we own this house together and I love this house and I don't want to leave this house and I can't afford it. So there were just so many more things. And everybody says the second year of marriage is the hardest and you don't really know what's coming after that. So you don't know if this is just a blip that you can get over and your relationship's going to be so much better, or if this is the catalyst that causes the demise. You don't know. You only know in hindsight. So all you can deal with what is there. But yeah, when it was just me, I had gone through all these things and it wasn't worth changing my life yet. The benefits didn't, outweigh the uncomfortability of the leaving portion. And then that's right, when I had my son, it just became like there was this whole other person that I'm now responsible for, that I now have to teach. And I cannot let him grow up like this. Like in that way, my son is my absolute savior.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for him.
Yeah. And at the same time, your absolute like number one priority that you will protect at all costs, right? So you said that generally speaking, what did it for you was that he was treating you in ways that you could not allow your son to be exposed in learning that is the way that somebody should treat somebody. And I assume it wasn't a single incident. That was like an ongoing thing. Was there a specific incident that like really set you towards, okay, I actually have to separate with this person? Or was it an eventual decision that you came to?
Yeah, I think it was kind of like a series of events. And Thor, Love and Thunder had a little bit to do with it, which is pretty funny.
Wow. Let's hear it.
But so
we're going really Gen Z mode here. Yeah.
I know. So what had happened was Phil had renovated this house that he had bought really like on his own. He had been really hyper independent. He was super proud of, buying this house on his own. And I did contribute and I did help out, but we kind of viewed it as like that was Phil's house. And we were lucky enough to kind of catch that moment in the market where houses suddenly increased massively. So it was never our intent to live in that house. Phil just wanted to do that for income. That was kind of his business plan. And so we had originally thought about renting the house out, and we decided that was a great time that we could sell the house and perhaps we could take that money and we could buy a cottage. We could buy something closer to the water because we live in Muskoka. So we sold that place. And with that money, that same night, we were able to buy a cottage.
Wow.
Like a really beautiful 3-bedroom, just like a small thing close to the town of Bracebridge. And we love that cottage so much. And we decided that we were going to Airbnb that was also going to be another source of income. Because our goal was to work as hard and as smart as possible through the summer and then be able to continue to have winters off, have a life where we could have winters off and we could go traveling, we could take our son traveling, we could kind of live that really free lifestyle that we wanted and not be tied down to bosses or to corporations. And so that was another avenue of revenue for us. But unfortunately, a lot of that fell on me. So a lot of all of the administration of our lives fell on me in the best of times and a lot of the financial decisions. But then when we started the Airbnb, it was very clear that I was going to be the one to kind of do that. And so there was just so much going on in our lives. There was so much happening, and I was really at my wit's end. I mean, Phil was already being like very mean to me and very demeaning, and I was just trying to take on all this stuff. And I remember I was having like a Marco Polo conversation with my friends, and I was trying to change these bed sheets at the cottage, and I was just absolutely bawling. And my friend said, like, this doesn't need to be this hard. Like, you need to ask for help. You need help. And so I sat down with Phil in May, and I just said, we were at the cottage, and I just said, like, I can't do all of this. Like, I'm, on the board of directors. I'm in charge of our baby in every way. I'm taking care of him. I'm doing all of his administration. I'm doing all the administration of our lives. I'm paying all the bills. I'm doing the Airbnb. I work for my dad. I'm doing the administration for my father as well in all hours. Like, I'm at my wit's end. I can't do this anymore. And I said, I need you to do something. I need you to just pay the bills. If you just took the pressure of the bills off of me, I feel like that could give me like enough breathing space that I could settle down. And he just said no. He basically said, like, if you're doing it on the computer, it's not a real job. You're not really doing things. You're not really painting. You're not cutting the lawn. You're not doing the important things in our life. And I just realized that I was never going to get help. I already felt like I was swimming upstream, and I had a body that I was carrying along with me, and I just could not get anywhere. I was just treading water, and I felt so frustrated and so powerless. And it was in May, I really realized this was not going to get any better. There was no help and no recognition of my boundaries or what I needed. And so I knew that was it. But I had to really think about it. I had to still figure out a way, because now we have 2 properties. We have a child. We have, we're very involved with our parents' lives. Like, there's just too much to just say one day, like, this is over and walk away. Like, where was I even going to live? Where was he going to live? What was going to happen? And, at that time, he had just stopped working for my father, but previous to that, like, he worked for my father. That was his source of income. So if we broke up, what was going to happen there? So I kind of sat through the summer, and I worked on the problem in the background myself. And I kind of slyly consulted people, and I figured out, if it was possible to leave, how could I do this? And so one night I just said, listen, I have to go to the movies. I'm tired. I need a break. And so I went to the theater, and I saw Thor: Love and Thunder. I was all by myself eating popcorn. And that whole scene where Natalie Portman and Chris Helms are kind of growing apart, I just realized, like, that's it. That's it. What can you do? That's what happened. That's where I am. There's no help. I can't do this. And so I went home that night, and I just said, listen, I need to move into the cottage. I need time for myself to figure out what's going on. Let's have shared custody with Beckett while I figure out what's happening. So I moved out in September 2022 on the long weekend. And
was he receptive to when you said that? Or I assume he kind of read between the lines.
Yeah.
And that what you were looking for was a separation.
I think he understood. He understood in the terms that he saw how unhappy I was. He saw how stressed out I was. So I think he kind of thought it was also a good idea, but he also didn't take me seriously. And so that was probably, I don't know, the end of July or August. I told him I had to leave. The cottage wasn't free till September. So there was still that whole month or 6 weeks where we lived together. And I was often met with, like, I think he asked me 3 or 4 times, like, well, you're not really leaving though, are you? And every time it would be, yes, I really am. And we'd still go out for the weekend, and we'd still go out and do fun things. And I just knew, though, that I had to go. My foot was already out the door, and it's the furthest that it's ever been. And he was acting like everything was normal and fine. And then every once in a while, yeah, but you're not going. We're fine, right? And then even the day that I left, I was packing up. And he said, you're not packing up. You're not going. And I said, no, I'm really going. And he said, well, you're just neurotic and you're the one that's breaking up this family then. And he left. And I just thought, I got to go. And I got in that car. And the second that I was at the cottage, it was just like, oh, yes.
The wave of relief.
Yeah, it was just like, this is, wow, like I'm finally free. But we still had a vacation planned with his family. And I was the one, too, that pushed booking that vacation because I wanted Beckett to see his cousins. I wanted Beckett to see his grandparents. And so in October, we still went on a vacation with his family. And Beckett got to spend time with his cousins. And I was there. And they knew we were separated, but they also kind of thought that maybe we were trying to work through it. And when we got home from that vacation, we were together and I just said, that this is over, right?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it went a little bit better than the cases I see where one person is quite controlling. They usually have a huge fit. Because, that is the ultimate sort of loss of control you have over your spouse, right?
Absolutely.
And it drives them mad. At the time of separation, your child was 2.
Yes.
There must have been a lot of, because depending on how old your child is, the prospect of separation can feel very differently, right? Generally speaking, I think, older the child, the more at ease you are about the prospect of separating. 2 is like, you still have at least like 16 years ahead of you where you have to raise this child. And so that must have been very daunting.
I did not recognize that till now. That has been an ongoing feature in my life. And if there's one statement of the should, like, oh my God, I have to deal with this person for 14 more years. I did not recognize it at the time. But I was really lucky in the sense that I had a friend who had just also separated from her husband. And she had a 2-year-old and I think a 4-year-old. And I called her and just said, like, hey, how are you doing this? How are you structuring your time? Like, what exactly happened? I just basically asked to know everything. And I just told her, like, I'm also wanting to get separated. And, so it was a really great help to have that resource and to have a friend that had been through it. And that's how I kind of came up with a schedule of how we were going to share custody and things like that. And I think that's why women are each other's greatest resources. And that's, kind of why I'm here today as well. Since I've been so open about being separated and trying to get divorced, there's a lot of women in my community who've come to me and said, I'm not happy in my marriage. What can I do? Where should I go? What do I need to do? And so it's been really great for me to be able to be that resource for them as well.
Yeah.
But it also, in another way, is dangerous because when some of my married friends are really unhappy, I'm like, leave him. Leave him. So I do recognize that I'm a very dangerous person.
Yeah. At 2, I guess they're too young for you to even sort of, because usually there's an issue of like, how do you break the news to your child? Yeah. But at 2, it's not really.
No, and that was the beauty too. And that's some of the reason why I wanted to do this early is because in talking with my friend, she's like, she doesn't know anything different. She's 2. She has no idea. Just sometimes she's with daddy. Sometimes she's with mommy. She's always happy. She has no idea. And now that Beckett's 4, he is really coming to that point where he wants mommy and daddy to be together or do things. Or a couple times he said, like, I want daddy to come move into the house with you. Or, I want mommy and daddy to be together. So it's now that he's starting to recognize, although he's not capable of really grasping human relationships yet. So he doesn't understand the difference between marriage and not married. Like, that'll be things that we deal with as we go along. Yeah. But it's just been very normal. And so sometimes too, he'll just say, I don't want to go to daddy's or I don't want to go to mommy's. And we just say, like, oh, but we're sharing you. And this is how this works, is that we both want to share you.
Yeah.
So it's only now that he's really starting to recognize. So I am grateful that I left early because that was one more thing that I didn't have to deal with.
And at the time in the immediate aftermath of separation, you sort of consulted your friends, let's say, as a set of resource. At what point did you get a lawyer?
Yeah. So I was consulting my friends. Before I had even left the house, I booked the appointment for the therapist. So I already had a therapist. Because I had been a law clerk and I was so used to legal terms, I actually, in September when I moved out, I went to Staples and I bought they have kind of the write your own divorce kits. So
I do not know about
they
that.
do.
But I have to go
They're
check it out.
Yeah, write your own separation agreement.
Wow.
And they give you like a basically standard form and then you can just fill it out. So Phil and I had talked about not wanting to waste money on lawyers, wanting to be amicable. So I went and got this write your own separation agreement and really started to go through it. And it was at that point I realized like although I'm comfortable with the law and legal terms, this is above me for sure. So I called in to a law firm that wasn't in my town. I wanted someone that wasn't that couldn't accidentally share gossip because we hadn't advertised at that point that we weren't together. I mean, I think it even took me 2 weeks to tell my family that I was actually living at the cottage. I just wasn't there visiting. And I don't even think he told his parents for 3 weeks or so. Like we weren't quite ready to tell people. So I booked a consultation with a lawyer whom I love so much. She's so great. And I just spent an hour with her asking all these questions, asking how the procedure works, what were my rights, what were his rights, what if we didn't want to sell the cottage, what if we wanted to keep it, like how do we have to divide assets? So I spent that hour kind of getting everything together. And it was probably 6 or 7 more months had gone by before I realized that our goals were very different.
That you couldn't do it on your own.
That's right.
Yeah.
That, we had toyed with the idea of keeping the cottage and leaving it for Beckett. But in order to do that, we'd have to run it as an Airbnb, which meant that again would fall on me. And so I was going to spend...
You have to do all the bills.
Yeah. So I was going to spend the next 14 years cleaning the cottage and getting the cottage ready and doing the bookings and getting insurance. And I didn't want to do that. And so again, I sat down with a friend and her husband, and he's in finance, and we had a really frank discussion of where am I financially and where do I want to be? And when we talked about the cottage and leaving things to Beckett, he was like, in a way, you're almost leaving him a burden. Like, who says he wants to continue to live here when he's 18? Who says he wants this cottage? What kind of shape is that cottage going to be in by the time he gets it? How much repair is going to need to be done? How much are you going to have to fight with someone who already is so controlling about money to get things done? And it just came to this point where I realized that this was not going to be as amicable as we wanted anymore. And Phil was still living in the house. I was still paying for part of the mortgage. I was still paying half of the insurance and trying to live on my own, which again, like, absolute gratitude to my parents. They allowed me to live in an apartment that they had. I didn't have to pay rent while I was figuring everything out. Like, that is absolute true love. And I'm so blessed to have the parents that I do. But yeah, I had all these expenses, and Phil wasn't concerned about my expenses. He was only concerned about me making sure I paid half. And at that point, because we hadn't really started the legal proceedings, he also wasn't paying child support because he did earn more than me. Not a lot more, but enough. And so it became clear that that consultation was going to have to turn into an actual retainer and a hiring of a lawyer, probably 7-8 months.
Oh, so it was 7 to 8 months post-separation that you ended up retaining a lawyer.
Yeah.
Got it.
So I had consulted with her in September, and then it was probably like maybe March.
Got it.
March, April, before I retained her and was like, okay. But again, still very much with the focus of, I don't want this to be taken to litigation. Let's just negotiate. Let's do the best that we can. But I was working with a very obstinate person. So we said in May, we've got to sell this cottage.
Yeah.
Okay, it's time to put this cottage on the market. But Phil was still very much, I want to provide for my son and I want to leave this to him. And this is a really great accomplishment for me, which I absolutely understand. And I want to keep it. But it was very clear that the terms of keeping it meant that I was going to be the one looking after it. And I did not want that.
Yeah.
So, it was a lot of like kind discussions between lawyers till finally it was like, no, you're either listing this cottage or we will go to court. You have a week.
Yeah.
And that's not the way that I wanted any of it to go down. But that's been the way it's consistently gone down. Is like, even living in the house, like, okay, we've looked into how much the primary residence, like a matrimonial home, is worth. Leanna obviously doesn't want it. You do. So you're either buying it or we're selling it. And, then there was a lot of back and forth. And then finally it's like, okay, if on this date you don't agree to buying the house, we're getting a court order to sell it. And it's just been like that the whole time. It's been terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. After you had the consultation, the decision not to involve lawyers right away, was that mainly for financial reason, or was it just this optic of involving lawyers felt very adversarial, just unnecessary? Like, what was the reason behind, well, in your head, behind not retaining a lawyer right away?
I think it's a common mistake. So in the people that have consulted me as well, that are thinking about leaving their husband or have or are leaving their husband, that's the first thing everybody says is, this is going to be amicable. It's not. And even if it is, you should still have a lawyer to tell you what your rights are anyway. This is an extremely important decision. When you have children, it can affect you till your child is 24 or sometimes beyond. If there was ever a time to speak to an expert, this is it. You should really get advice before you get married on what marriage means. And you should really get advice, even if it is going to be amicable, you really should be talking to a lawyer to figure out what your rights are. And so I think there was a bit of a mixture there. As we didn't want to spend the extra money on the lawyers because we didn't believe that we needed it. But we also didn't want to insert 2 more people that we thought wouldn't necessarily understand our goals and that might be committed for their own reasons to move things along too fast, to make things adversarial, to want to go to court.
Yeah.
And so that kind of hesitation created, a real lag in time. Yeah.
It's tricky because, there's obviously, I understand where that concern comes from. And if I was a regular consumer of legal services and I was in need of a not just a family lawyer, but any kind of lawyer, the thought would run through my mind that, if they are billing me per amount of hours that they are spending on my case, then obviously there's an incentive for them to spend more time on the file than not, right? To be frank, do lawyers like that exist? I'm sure they do. I'm not going to speak for everyone and say that that's everybody's as principled as they can be. I guess I just want to also sort of give some confidence to people that are listening in that, there are many lawyers who like really care about, one, the work that they do and the people that they serve. Like for example, there was a study done. I don't actually personally know the study. It's just something I heard from a colleague. But apparently they did a study across Canada of all different industries in law. And they found that family lawyers were the most stressed and the most underpaid. All that to say, I think, generally speaking, when a family lawyer is a family lawyer, money is not the motivating factor there. Because if it was, they wouldn't be a family lawyer. I guarantee that much as the truth. So first of all, know that there are plenty of lawyers out there who genuinely care about your well-being and making sure that you get the best outcome as possible. And often that means, and I can certainly say that that's for the philosophy I have at my office is, you do not want to go to court. And I'll tell you straight up, you do not want to spend money on me to go to court for you. You're going to go bankrupt. No. Okay. That being said, sometimes it's absolutely necessary, which I will be there for you to do that work. But I will tell them, my goal for you is to keep you outside of court because you don't want to see me every day, in person. Going to this random courthouse, and I want to get your file from my desk and away as soon as possible, and that means getting you a resolution. I tell them too, and some lawyers are going to be fixated on what the law says. What are you legally entitled to? And they sort of try and make sure that you get what it is that you're entitled to. My philosophy, for example, and it's not just me, it's many other lawyers who are a lot more settlement oriented have a different view, which is my job is to tell you what the law is. Okay. And my job is to give you the pros and cons and tell you what you're entitled to. But at the end of the day, you as a client are in the driver's seat, right? And if you say to me, you know what, I know that I'm entitled to $100,000, let's say, but I'm willing to accept $70,000, as in forego the $30,000 that I'd be otherwise entitled to, if it means that I can just be done with this and move on with my life. Some lawyers, I'm sure, will not even let you do that, because why are you wasting away $30,000? Myself, I deeply recognize that you can't really put a value or a price on peace, closure, the amount of time that you'll gain by not having to deal with me or this nonsense. And perhaps most importantly, if you're a parent, the preventing the exposure of conflict to the child, because at the end of the day, that child is absorbing every one of your moods, your stresses, and the conflict that's going on between you and your spouse, right? So, all that to say, I totally appreciate that a regular person who might be going through a separation might feel hesitant to reach out to a lawyer and engage their services. But, to your point, first of all, it's very, very important that you at least understand the law, which you can't on your own.
Absolutely.
And that you have somebody sort of by your side telling you what it is that you are entitled to and what you're not, okay? And there are plenty of people out there, plenty of lawyers out there who will do just that for you, and without, this motive to, get more money out of you than necessary, let's say.
And I think that's really more of a stereotype too, from TV and movies. Like, to be honest, that consultation, I think, cost me $300. And it was probably the best $300 that I've spent through this whole process, because it really allowed me to see what I was up against and what I could accomplish and not. My lawyer is fantastic. She tells me the law all the time, but keeps me very free to do what I want. She's even offered me ways in that I can save money, that if I needed to draft things or if I wanted to draft letters, and I've drafted letters and given them right to her and said, make whatever changes you want, but that's the letter. Because that's what I did. I drafted letters for almost a decade. Like, I can easily draft a letter. And so that saved me a lot of money. And she's been more than thrilled that I did that for her, because her plate is full.
Yeah.
And I think, really the thing is, especially when you're in a relationship where there's an element of control, that doesn't stop because you leave the house. That doesn't stop because you want to be separated. And so there's this whole element of control now over the finances. And there's a whole, narrative that's being really spun against me. And it's only my lawyer who can help me see the truth of what it is I'm really entitled to and what it is I really deserve. And then if I want to make my own decision about how I get out of that, she's more than supportive about it. Yeah. And it almost, at this point, it's almost to the point where I think she's being more forgiving, and I'm the one that's saying, maybe it is time to go to court. Like, maybe we have done all that we can do. And there's just no point in negotiating, because at this point as well, my ex doesn't have a lawyer. So he's already been through 2 lawyers. And I've given him the draft of a final separation agreement, and he doesn't want to take it to a lawyer. He doesn't want to have lawyers anymore, and he wants language drafted in it that says he waives legal advice because he is so upset with lawyers. But at the same time, he's trying to say, but I didn't understand what marriage meant. I didn't understand what going into it meant. And so now I want to be really cautious about getting out. And it's like, legitimately, you cannot be conscious and informed about leaving a marriage, about a separation agreement, unless you have a lawyer or you are a lawyer.
Yeah.
This is what people deal with. People have specialties, and this is what you've spent all that time in law school doing. This is what you've spent all that time in practicing. And you're worth paying to get the best deal, to get closure, but also to not have those regrets. Yeah. So if I was just to sign away a piece of paper and sign away my rights, what could I do about it in 10 years? But I now know that whatever piece of paper I signed is the best decision that I could make for me at that time. And I never have to second guess that.
Yeah.
Right? Because I have all the facts. I have, the people behind me. I've got the right advice. And so whatever I decide is the right decision. And I never have to second guess that.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you are your own person and you have the freedom to make your own decision. And as you should, nobody should make the decisions for you. But the decision you make needs to be an informed one.
Absolutely.
If you're not informed, if you're not educated, you're not really making a decision, right? And so, and the only way, unfortunately, or fortunately, for anybody in a family law context to be educated and to be informed about their rights and obligations and the law is to have a lawyer. I really want to emphasize this too, that this is especially important for people who are in that sort of abusive dynamics because, and I hear this over and over and over again, I'm in a consult and, the potential client tells me, my controlling ex told me that I could never get child support, that I could never get this house, that the law says X, Y, Z. I say to them, you're going to erase everything that your ex has told you. Okay, and we're talking about, first of all, somebody who wants to be controlling of you, who quite literally has the opposite of your best interest at heart. And so first of all, we're going to scrap everything that he said. Going forward, you are not going to allow any external sources, not just your ex, but anybody else, even your friends that may tell you this is what the law says, because frankly, they don't know. And the only source of authority from this point on is going to be me, or if they retain me, or other lawyer if they decide to retain somebody else. Misinformation is powerful, right? When a controlling spouse says to them, you're never going to get this property or money from me if you leave the house or if you leave this relationship, they believe it.
Absolutely.
A lot of the times they believe that. And more the reason why you really need that representation to tell you that, first of all, that's not true. That second of all, that's not okay. And third of all, here are all your options. Here are, 5 different things that you could be doing right now to protect yourself and perhaps more importantly, your child who's in the middle of all that conflict, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if we'll get into that. There is a piece about Bunny and my child, but we even did mediation as well. So we did mediation, but we did it without our lawyers. But thankfully, I was actually helped by my therapist through that. So before we had the mediation session, my therapist just said, you know what? Listen, buckle in. Like, you're in for the long ride now. Just go into this as an experiment and see what it is he really thinks about you. See what it is he really thinks about the situation. See what it is that he really wants. And keep it light and funny. Make jokes in your head if you have to. Like, it's great. And I did. And so we ended up having 3 sessions of mediation. But I saw how he even bullied the mediator. And he did have tantrums and fits. And he did yell. And by the end, the mediator was almost a little bit more on his side and was so desperate to make a deal that he wanted to put together a deal where, Phil got, I think it was 65% of the price of the cottage. And then he put $10,000 into an account that we could spend on travel. And I would only have 35 or 40% or whatever it was of what was left, which is ludicrous. I cannot tell you how insane that is. And, that's another legal professional. And it was just me and him there. But I recognized, because I had these therapy sessions, because I had really gone into it with my lawyer beforehand, and we just viewed it as an experiment, as an opportunity to figure out how far apart we were and what really he wanted. But yeah, if I had never consulted a lawyer and I had only gone into that mediation, I might have thought that was my best deal and this mediator was acting in my best interest. And I assure you that they are not.
Yeah, well, that's a very important point, actually, because I think, affordability issue with hiring lawyers, it's a known issue. And so, I think a lot of people gravitate towards mediations, which is totally fine. I encourage it. But understand that, as you said, mediators are not your lawyers. Mediators are not necessarily looking for your best interests, and they certainly can't give you legal advice. They're literally there just to see if they can close the gap and get you guys to an agreement. And that agreement may not necessarily be informed by your specific legal rights and obligations. So even when you have a mediator or you go to mediation sessions, still very important that if you can, get your own legal representation. And I also want to make this clear, you speaking to a lawyer is completely confidential and completely private. Even after you retain a lawyer, it's only when you want to make it known to the other side that you have now retained a lawyer that they will be informed as such, meaning
Absolutely.
you have complete control over letting anybody in your life, including your ex, know whether you spoke to a lawyer or have retained a lawyer. So if anybody's out there who's afraid of reaching out to a lawyer and scheduling a consultation or speaking with a lawyer because they feel afraid that the other person is going to find out and there's going to be some consequences, know that you have control over that information. As in, the lawyer is certainly not going to. There's no obligation on the lawyer to make the fact that you have consulted them be known. And it's a completely confidential process. So rest assured that if you need to speak to a lawyer, and more people than not really need to speak to a lawyer, that you can do so in complete confidence.
And that's what my first consultation was as well. That was done in secret. It was booked in secret. It was done in secret. And that's why I chose the lawyer I did, because she lived in a different town. And that was a great help. It really was. I'm really glad I went through the mediation process. I'm really glad I did it with such lightheartedness and as an experiment, because you are right, the mediator is really there to close the gap. And in all fairness to the mediator as well, they don't have enough time to really know you and know your case. So I had consulted my lawyer, with the first consultation. Then she had been my lawyer for, I don't know, maybe even close to a year. We had had phone conversations. We were emailing each other. There was a lot of camaraderie. She really understood my story. And then you go into a mediation and that person has maybe 10 minutes with you before the mediation starts. There is absolutely no way they're really going to grasp the facts the way that someone you've spent a year with has. And, that's no knock against the mediator. And this is no knock against mediation, because I also agree it's a really important process and it can be a really great step for people. But it's also understanding that that is not the same as a lawyer. And, I cannot emphasize enough that just consulting a lawyer, just that initial consultation is just so important. And it's the easiest thing that you can do. And it's one of the greatest things that you can do, because it's just going to set you up for what you want in the future. And you might recognize that you want mediation from there. You might recognize that you and your spouse can go to Staples and get that separation agreement and put that together yourselves. Or you might really come to realize that your goals are so different that, that is not the route to take for you. You might realize you have to go to court, but until you book a consultation and speak to a lawyer, you really don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. And as you said that the $300 or something that you spent on the consultation, it was the best piece of money that you spent. And, it might quite literally be true that that's the best money that you'll ever spend for anybody, especially in a situation like that you've been in. Everybody that I speak to at a consult, they all walk away feeling empowered by knowing now that they have options, first of all. And second of all, a lot more informed about the state of the being, right? If you're feeling stressed, if you're absolutely afraid, oftentimes that source of stress is uncertainty, right? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what options are available. You don't know if you're going to be okay, right? That's not to say that, everything will be, super easy and that you're going to have a great time, what have you. But it is to say that, believe me when I say there are options. Believe me when I say that we have a system in place that's designed to protect people who need protection. That's equitable, that will, to a certain extent, ensure justice, that justice is served, okay? Speaking to a lawyer for an hour and coming to that understanding, and not only that as a general principle, but for you to understand that for your specific circumstance, these are the rights that you're afforded. these are the options that are available before you, and here's how you can go about those options, and here's how we can achieve your specific goals. That's empowerment.
And I think it's really that old item that knowledge is power. And that's what it is. Once you are able to consult with the lawyer, you can really set your trajectory of what you want to do and where you want to go. And like for me, we discussed that it took me a while to figure out what it was I really wanted. But then once I did and realized that it was going to be adversarial, then I already have that person. I already have that contact. I feel comfortable with this person. They've given me great advice. And so that's now one less thing that I have to do. And let's say it was to go the other way and it was very amicable. At least I know my rights now. And I think too, and I know I've heard you talk about it on your Instagram page as well, that's a really great thing to do before you get married. And, I really thought I knew what I was getting into when I got married. And in a lot of ways, legally I did. But, my ex would say he really did not know what marriage was. He didn't really understand the marriage contract. And I think had he known, maybe he would have made a different decision, and that was up to him. But, just the idea that the knowledge is power, know what you're getting into, because this seriously impacts your life for the rest of your life.
Yeah. I mean, can I safely assume that if I asked you whether you would have liked to consult a lawyer before you got married, that you would say yes to that?
Yeah, now I would say yes to that, especially just for a prenuptial agreement, because the reality is we all have a prenuptial agreement. It's just, is it the government that made your prenuptial agreement, or is it you that's making your prenuptial agreement? And so I think that there's a lot of value in that. But also, I think it's time to really talk about and explore that this idea of marriage is about romance and love. And there's an element that's absolutely about romance and love. But in a very real way, marriage is a legal contract, and it really is about legal obligations, and it really is about business. And so particularly, I'd say in the past year, I think I spent a year really caring and really trying and, really going through this divorce. And this past year, I've recognized that this isn't about a relationship anymore. This is now about business. I am in the business of my divorce. I'm here to get the best deal that I can for myself. I'm here to get the best deal that I can for my son without setting any fires or burning any bridges. But this is about business. It's not about a relationship anymore, and it's not about love. And that's the attitude with which I'm going forward. It's not about righteousness. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's not about, righting things in the relationship that have been put wrong. This is a business transaction now. It's a legal transaction. And that's the way it should really be dealt with.
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback, I suppose, to this idea of consulting a lawyer before getting married. And whenever I put out that idea, the comments are always the same, right? The critics say, well, obviously you would advocate for that because you make money. And I'm like, well, then don't do it and find out what happens. I'll see you in 10 years and I'm like a lot more money off of you. I promise you that much. It's like...
Yeah, and I think that's a feature of, I don't even want to say Western culture, but when you're getting in a relationship with a person, what's really important to talk about? Breaking up with that person. How do you want to have a breakup? What is cheating to you? What are your boundaries? What aren't? It's about that communication. So when you're beginning something, you should talk about ending something. When you're, getting married, you should be talking about what would the end of that marriage look like. And I mean, even in another greater spiritual sense, which is something I work with all the time, we should be thinking about our death. We should be thinking about the death of those around us. We should also be thinking about our will. We should be thinking about our passwords. But we should also be thinking about, what we want to do with this life, because it's finite. Everything is finite and everything changes. And there's nothing wrong or there's nothing negative with being upfront and dealing with, okay, well, when this changes, okay, well, when this ends, what does that look like? That's smart.
Yeah.
That's not pessimistic. That should be something that we all, strive towards and are rewarded for thinking in that way.
Yeah. And look, it's hard. It's uncomfortable. We get that. Nobody likes to open a bottle of wine on a Friday night and start talking about the demise of their relationship. But like, it's an important conversation.
It is.
And I think I read somewhere the other day that if you are unprepared or incapable of having these hard conversations, you have no business getting married. Believe me when I say marriage is one of the hardest, if not the hardest, things you'll ever do.
Absolutely.
And especially so for maintaining a healthy marriage, right? All that to say, the business of marriage comes with a great set of responsibilities. How can you really be responsible for something that is so impactful and grand in your life if you're not willing to have tough conversations? Because if you think a divorce or a separation is not a possibility in your world, then with all due respect, you are very naive, right? And in fact, it's when somebody acknowledges that their marriage can end, that their marriage is not bulletproof, it's not ironclad, I think that's when people, ironically, have a better chance at sustaining that marriage long term, right? You hear all the time of people prioritizing their career, their work events over their family events, right? Like you cancel on a dinner with your wife because you have this thing that comes up at your work. When have anybody ever heard somebody canceling work plans to make it to a dinner date with their spouse? I've never heard that. At the very least, it's not a common thing.
Right.
And so you think, well, then clearly the message we're putting out there is that we value and prioritize our employment over our marriage. But that's not necessarily true, though, is it? Nobody would outright admit that their employment is more important than their marriage. But our sort of where we place our values and our behavior are misaligned, right?
Absolutely.
And if you think about why that is, if you think about why people try much harder to please their bosses than their spouses, it's because there are consequences associated with not catering to your boss's needs and wants, i.e., termination. In the marriage context, that termination means a separation and a divorce. And so if people really understood, and this isn't just fiction, like this is the truth here, that if you don't treat your spouse well, if you're not at all times trying to prioritize them over everything else, your marriage will end, right? And if it doesn't, you're in for a very miserable ride. And so, I think it's about time that we change this perception about this approach that we have with marriage. That yes, there is an element of love and romance, but let's recognize that it is also a business venture. That there's a lot of these practical elements to it that you really have to sort of focus on. It will only be your happily ever after if you put in the requisite work to make it so.
I think really being honest with yourself as to what your intentions are, but also recognizing that all marriages end. 100% of marriages end. And they can either end because someone wants out of them prematurely, or they end because someone dies. They will end. And so even if you're consulting a lawyer when you're getting married to look at what does it look like if my spouse dies? How should we put properties in whose name? Where should we put finances? Where should we so it's more than just recognizing that these things end, because really marriage, like you said, is the absolute hardest relationship. And I think it was Joni Mitchell who has a quote that's, says something along the lines of like, if you want the same person, then date a whole bunch of people and you'll just keep hitting the same person over and over again. And it's the most boring thing. But if you want to be with 1,000 people, then stay with one person, stay with that same person, because you're going to see so much growth. You're going to see so much change. You're going to see the death of who they used to be, a rebirth of who they are or are they becoming. And there's going to be so many different interests and hobbies they have. And they're really going to grow, and you get to be there and witness that. And that really is an honor. It's really a privilege, but it doesn't always mean that that journey is spent the whole time together. And so it really is difficult. And I really didn't start this marriage with the intention of it being over. But it just got to the point where it just wasn't viable or healthy to keep it going. And so the best thing to do really was to go. And that was my option. I don't know if having a consultation before I got married would have changed anything, but it also would have made me feel better when I did leave, because I feel like I would have already known my rights. So I would have already known that I needed child support right off the bat. So I wasn't scrimping and scrounging. I would have known right away that, what home was the matrimonial home, how much I was entitled to. I would have understood about, the net family profit statements, which, I already did understand a little bit about, but just to get that refresher as well would have been, really empowering by the time it was time to go.
Yeah. Speaking of love and romance, Liana, being where you are now and having gone through what you went through, and this is a question I ask everybody that comes on here. Do you still believe in love and marriage?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'd really love to get married again. I have really focused on keeping an open heart through all of this, and really learning to prioritize my peace over other people's uncomfortability. And so that means that I do have the hard conversations with people. And if there is someone that's interested, I tell them all about my life and what's going on. And we have a frank talk about what their goals are and what my goals are. So there's a lot more maturity behind everything. But for certain, I absolutely believe in love and marriage.
Yeah. The type of person that you are, Liana, clearly you have a lot of love to give. And unfortunately, your ex just happened to be somebody that couldn't appreciate all the amount of love that you were so willing to give. And, sometimes I find that somebody in your shoes, through that experience, either learn never to trust again or to change the way they operate, in a sense that they start to be more defensive and be a bit more on guard and be more transactional with the amount of love that they give. And what I really appreciate about you saying that you still very much believe in love, that you would love to be married again, and clearly you want to sort of not hold back on the type of person that you are, which is a very loving person, because there's so much joy, right, Liana, in being the giver. In sharing the love, all the love that you have inside of you. And it's a matter of finding somebody who will appreciate all the love that you have to give, as opposed to a question of whether you are giving too much love in the first place.
Yeah.
Right?
I think there's a lot of joy in life. Like every day that we wake up alive is a miracle and something to be celebrated. And I think that this experience has really tested my ability to love unconditionally, because although all of those things happened with Phil, I absolutely still love him in an unconditional way. And I recognize that, him being alive is just a miracle. And although we don't get along all of the time and we have different views, I recognize that he has autonomy as a person, and he is allowed to live his life however he wants to live his life. And those are his choices. And whether we agree or not doesn't really matter, that I can still have love for him and have love for people. And I think that in that way, going through this all is really a gift, because it's really taught me about love. It's really taught me about forgiveness. It's really taught me about my boundaries. And it's really allowed me to explore the things that I'm afraid of in life, afraid of being alone or afraid of displeasing people. And at the end, all I can do is just really be thankful for that gift. And I mean, I have the gift of a beautiful son out of this as well, that I get to watch grow, and is just hilarious and makes me laugh every day. So yeah, really, I'm lucky about all of it.
Yeah, and 4 years old, that's it's exciting, but it's also very tiring, I'm sure. So it's a lot of work.
I think he's just fueled by the sun. He is nonstop, and he never stops talking. At night, he's a nighthawk, and it'll be like 9:30 and he's still talking, and I'm tired, and it's just become like, I love you, be quiet, good night. Every night, just, I love you, be quiet, good night.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's wonderful. Yeah.
There's a lot of single parents out there who are now looking to get back into the dating pool. How do you feel about that?
So dating is different. I haven't really dated per se, but I recognize that now it's just not about me and whether I have physical attraction for someone. If there's someone that's interested in having a relationship with me, I have to understand that there's also another person involved, and that's my son. And to some extent, my ex-partner is involved in the relationship as well. But I would honestly warn people and be very cautious. It wasn't so much my marriage that really, I would say, destroyed me. It was the relationship I got into after my marriage that was so incredibly painful and was so incredibly eye-opening. The marriage was nice because I felt like I had a space to make a decision that I didn't want to be in it anymore. I had time to work through it. I had really worked through a lot of my feelings and what had happened by the time I was ready to leave. I had a lot of support when I left. And then when I kind of had a relationship after that, which was a little bit more a situationship than I had actually realized, there was none of that. It was just a free fall. And I have to say, like, the streets out there are wild. Like, things are different. It's not like it was a decade ago. And even the idea of, situationships was not something that was around kind of before I got married. And I would be very cautious, I think, when you're dating, when you have a child. And particularly, and this has to be said, but for women that have daughters, you have to be very cautious, if you're heterosexual, about the men that you are bringing home. And you have to be very aware of the possibility of abuse of your daughters, both physically and mentally and emotionally, by this new partner. It's something that's sadly like a large statistic. And so in that way, you've really got to know who it is that you're bringing home when you do.
So was it mostly that in hindsight thinking that you wish that you didn't like rush as much, or you gave it more time, or was it that you feel like you could have been more observant? Or
I think you just have to be careful about the amount of heartbreak you let in your life. So if you're already dealing with a divorce, if you're already in a stressful situation and someone comes into your life, like, essentially I dated someone who had been a friend for a really long time, and we started a romantic relationship. We were both going through a divorce, although his was a lot more contentious than mine was. And we really, found a lot of commiseration with each other and a lot of comfort. And we really agreed that we would be easy on each other's hearts because that's what we needed. But it doesn't always work out like that, no matter what your intentions are. And so then when it became very painful and it was really hurtful and I really, my heart was really broken, then you're dealing with heartbreak on top of, still kind of dealing with a little bit of heartbreak from your marriage, still trying to deal with the stress of your divorce, still trying to deal with being a single parent. And so you just really have to be cautious about what it is you're going to let into your life.
Yeah. Is it fair to say then that the intention was for both of you to sort of be each other's crutches almost through the turmoil, let's say, that was your respective divorces?
Like in that way, it was beautiful because we called it, a couple times like a soft landing. Like it was a really nice soft landing. You had someone, and he had the same sorts of experiences with his ex that I did. And so there was a lot of, kind of breaking down what happened and how did we let this happen and kind of the aftermath of that. Like, how do we tell our families? How do we, navigate this so that it doesn't happen again? So there was a lot of solace in each other. But, at the same time, you absolutely do your best and you absolutely care for people. but you also can't control what people do. And sometimes when you have a lot of compassion and you have a lot of kindness, and somebody has had trauma in their past, you'll accept less than you deserve, or you'll accept behavior that's maybe not in line with how you want to be treated because you recognize their trauma and you recognize what's going on with them. And when you're really kind to someone and they're not on their best behavior, then you enable them to continue to perpetuate that kind of behavior because you're not prioritizing your peace. What you're doing is you're prioritizing their comfortability, but you're also really acting out of a place of love and kindness and recognition that this person has also been through it all. You acutely understand what they have been through. And so you're willing to really give them so much more of the benefit of the doubt. And so in that way, things can end up being really painful and really hurtful. And, that was something that's really important to me. So there's this person that's written kind of like an anarchist manifesto to relationships. And it's really beautiful. It's an older, I think it's a post on a blog from like 2012 or something. But one of the main tenets of having an anarchist relationship is to find your core set of relationship values and then establish those values throughout every relationship in your life. So it goes for friendships, it goes for family members, it goes for your paternal or relationships, your familial relationships, and it goes for romantic relationships as well. Because much too often in romantic relationships, we allow people to hurt us or we allow them to act in a not great manner because we feel that we have such an intimacy, such a closeness with them. But really, if we were to enact this kind of core set of values of making sure that all of our relationships maintain the same level of respect, then we won't find ourselves making exceptions for romantic relationships and we won't find ourselves as hurt about them after.
Yeah. Well, that's wise. Yeah. And it also goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is, it's a matter of compatibility almost too, right? It's just, you by nature are a very forgiving, you are a lot more accepting. And as a result, with the right person, you each get to reciprocate the amount of generous love that you're so willing to give. But with the wrong person, you're dumping all that love into this bottomless pit, that will never get filled, and to your detriment at the end of the day. So anything else that you wanted to cover, Leanna?
No, I don't think so. I think we talked about a lot of things.
We did. And well, first of all, you're a beautiful soul.
Oh, thank you.
Second of all, I know that so many people listening in are going to relate to what you had to say, and I'm particularly sort of happy that many people are going to feel empowered from being in an unhealthy dynamic with their partners, empowered knowing that first of all, what is happening to them is not right, and that second of all, that there are things you can do about it, and that third of all, you're going to be just fine. That you're going to it'll come with hard work. It'll require a lot of self-work. It'll require a lot of self-doubt, I'm sure, and a lot of sort of hardships, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I think you're proof of that. So
thank you.
I thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much. I have to say the same thing about you. You're so beautiful and you're really understanding. And I'm so grateful that you've kind of created this platform and created your Instagram account so that people who are looking for answers can find them, and they can find them from somebody who really wants to help. I mean, this is probably the darkest period of someone's life. And for someone like you to be there who really honestly cares and really wants to help people, that's really beautiful as well. And it's really what the world needs. So thank you so much.
Thank you. If you'd like to share your story in this podcast, or if you need a family lawyer, go to my website, jleefamily.com. That's JLEE family.com. Thanks for listening. And remember, it's going to be okay.